My name is Elias Maddox. I was 39 years old when my father died. That morning, Savannah was still in that eerie way only grief seems to conjure, where the world doesn't move quite right, like even the breeze is holding its breath. We buried him in the family plot behind the old Methodist chapel on Wilmington Island, the same place his father lay, the same place he'd asked me, in the last lucid hours before the cancer stole his voice, to return him to. His fingers had closed around mine in that hospital bed. Not with desperation, but with clarity. A surgeon's grip. Intentional. Protect the work, he whispered. Not the house. Not the estate. Not even the name. Just the work. I didn't cry at the funeral. My mother did, silently behind black lace. My sister didn't come. My father's oldest business partner, Malcolm Trenholm, stood beside me as they lowered the casket, his hand on my shoulder like a priest giving last rites. Your father built something rare. Elias Maddox, he murmured. Don't let grief cloud your mind. The board will need direction soon. Even then, something in his voice had curdled, something polished, rehearsed. I nodded, didn't answer. It was only 3 days later I found out Malcolm had filed paperwork to become interim CEO of Maddox Industrial Holdings. Without notifying me, without consulting the board. While I'd been sorting through my father's cufflinks and drafting his eulogy, Malcolm had been in Atlanta, making his move. The company was supposed to come to me. It wasn't about entitlement. I'd been working there since I was 23. Started in acquisitions, moved through every floor, every crisis, every merger. My father never handed anything to me. He tested me relentlessly. Some called it nepotism. I called it proving myself. Every quarter, every review, I had the scars to show for it. The late nights or sessions, the missed anniversaries, the failed marriage that had crumbled under the weight of always needing to be the son who was never seen as lucky, only worthy. So when the lawyer called to inform me that Malcolm had invoked a clause in the succession charter, one buried in a footnote, I said nothing. I listened. I thanked him for his diligence. Then I sat alone in the den of my father's house, surrounded by the scent of old wood and expensive books, and I listened to the quiet. I could have stormed, called reporters, threatened lawsuits, but something in me, something that belonged more to my father than myself, said, wait. The paperwork was dated the day of the funeral. Timestamp 10, dossier, Tumefren Terechini. We'd still been standing at the grave. That night, I walked the perimeter of the estate barefoot. It was something my father used to do when he needed to think. Feel the land under your feet. Elias, he once said, if your head gets loud, let the ground speak louder. I stepped slowly along the edge of the garden wall, the grass damp with summer dew. My father had left everything in legal order, but the board structure had changed 2 years ago. Quietly, legally, and Malcolm had been the one to draft those changes. I remembered the last conversation I'd had with Malcolm while my father was still alive. We'd been in his office, that quiet corner suite overlooking the Savannah River. I'd mentioned we should revisit the succession terms, just to ensure clarity when the time came. Malcolm had smiled, slow and kind. No rush. He said, your father's a fighter. And then he'd walked me out like we were still friends. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I read every clause of every agreement, every amendment to the charter, every memo Malcolm had sent in the last 18 months. I made no notes, took no screenshots. I memorized to which at 5:45. It effercern. I made coffee the way my father taught me, one scoop too strong, and I stood at the window, watching the light turn the live oaks gold. That's when the grief lifted just enough for something else to take its place. Not anger, resolve. When someone shows you who they are at the worst moment of your life, believe them. Malcolm Trenholm had stood beside me at the grave of the man who raised me and filed a hostile maneuver while I delivered the eulogy. That wasn't oversight. That was orchestration. The question wasn't whether I could fight him. The question was how to make sure he never saw me coming. Because this wasn't about reclaiming a title. It wasn't even about the company. It was about honoring the last thing my father ever asked of me. Protect the work. He meant the principles. The structure. The spine of what he built, the part that didn't show up in stock price but held the whole thing together. I couldn't do that by rage. I had to do it by precision. I had 60 days before the board would vote on whether Malcolm's interim status became permanent. 60 days to shift the narrative. I cleared my calendar, canceled my travel, and took leave from all public functions. Let Malcolm think I was drowning in grief. Let the press write me off as the absent heir, the disinterested son. I took breakfast alone in the study, rereading my father's journals. They weren't personal. They were architectural, notes on deals, quotes from competitors, strategies for lean times. But laced between the margins, I saw something else. Pressure points, names of board members and what they feared. Phrases like George folds under public scrutiny and Dale will side with power until power fails. Not gossipy, just observant. Patterns. Psychology. I started going for long walks at twilight, past the factories, past the construction sites, past the building my father had designed himself, the one that still bore the family name in steel letters 3 stories high. I'd stop and watch the workers file out, noticing who nodded to me. He did. Who didn't? I started paying attention again. I didn't want to scream. I wanted to see, because when you watch long enough, people forget you're watching. And that's when they show their real tells. Malcolm wanted legacy without labor. He wanted power without presence. And I had both. Still, all I had to do was make it visible again. But not to him. To the people who mattered. And I knew exactly where to start. I began with the shareholders. Not the ones who sat on the board, but the quiet ones, the long-game investors, the ones who didn't make noise in meetings, but held enough equity to shift weight when the vote came. I invited 2 of them to lunch, not together, separately. I didn't speak about the situation. I asked about their thoughts on legacy planning, on long-term growth, on stability. And I listened, really listened. One mentioned that Malcolm had called them last week, already floating new expansion plans that contradicted my father's final projections. Another noted a subtle change in tone from recent internal memos, more aggressive, more acquisition-focused, less rooted in the local ecosystem my father had fought to preserve. I let them speak, nodded where it mattered, offered no rebuttal, no player, just presence. Let them remember what quiet competence looks like. Back at the estate, I reviewed board voting histories. I mapped loyalties, patterns. There were 3 swing votes. 3 people who had historically followed majority consensus, but could be nudged by the right emotional weight. For them, I had to become more than a grieving son. I had to become my father's son. Strategically, intellectually, spiritually, at night. I wrote letters, real ones, pen on paper, to each board member, to each major investor. I didn't argue my case. I told stories about watching my father fix machines with his bare hands when the maintenance crews were stretched. About the time he stayed up 3 nights with a young engineer trying to salvage a failing prototype, not for glory, but because the team needed to believe in something. I wrote about the values that had built our company. Resilience, humility, precision. I asked them not to believe in me blindly, but to remember what this place stood for before we all had something to lose. I didn't ask for loyalty. I asked for memory. And slowly, it began to shift. People I hadn't heard from in years started calling. Not to pledge allegiance, but to ask questions. Real ones. Where did I stand? What were my plans if I returned? I gave no detailed answers. Only intent, steady voice, clear eyes, I'm not here to reclaim a throne. I said, I'm here to guard the foundation before it rots. Meanwhile, Malcolm grew louder. He made appearances, interviews, memos. He positioned himself as the steady hand in a time of mourning. The ship needs a captain. He told Business Weekly, we can't afford drift. But his words reeked of performance, of opportunism dressed as leadership. And the more he spoke, the more hollow he sounded. One morning, I received an envelope from the legal department. Inside were copies of recent executive orders Malcolm had signed reassigning key department heads, altering vendor contracts, accelerating asset liquidations, none illegal, all within his temporary purview, but rash and traceable. I didn't call him. I called a forensic analyst my father had once hired during an internal audit. Quiet man, brilliant. Trusted. I asked him to track the procurement changes, the vendor shifts, the sudden price variances in raw materials. He found what I suspected. Malcolm wasn't just accelerating change. He was consolidating leverage. Friends of his silent LLCs were profiting from the sudden transitions. Again, I said nothing, but I made a copy of every document, labeled Wisfurdius Shermanonmon, time-stamped. On the 47th day, I scheduled an off-the-record dinner with 3 of the swing voters. I didn't bring a lawyer. No slideshow. No binder. If Ferdid steering, just my voice. Power doesn't reveal character. I told them over the second course. It distills it. Malcolm has shown you his. They didn't respond, but they didn't look away. 2 days later, one of them sent a single-sentence email. I remember the man who built this place. The tide was shifting, but Malcolm didn't see it. He mistook my silence for absence, my stillness for surrender. So when he called a surprise press conference on the 54th day to announce an exciting new direction, I tuned in from my study, sipping black coffee as the camera flashed on his polished smile. We're entering a bold new chapter. So Mashari, he said, honoring the legacy of the past by stepping forward decisively into the future. Behind him, on a backlit screen, flashed a new logo. Srigor Slikasistorindu, cold. My father's name removed. They gasped. Even the journalist or no one for interim, Sorti Yervinmine, but Malcolm smiled through it, unfazed. This isn't about erasing history, he continued. It's about evolving. He didn't know that 3 board members had already voted for an emergency session. Didn't know the audit report had been pre-sent to every major stakeholder. Didn't know the legal team had quietly drafted reversal paperwork. He stood at that podium as though he'd already won. And that, more than anything, told me we were ready. I didn't need applause. I didn't need revenge. I needed one clean, precise strike. To end this with the same discipline I'd carried through every breath of grief. When the board convened privately that Friday, I didn't enter first. I waited. Let them gather. Let them whisper. Let them wonder. Then I stepped in, nodding politely, holding nothing but a leather folder. Malcolm looked up from his seat. Elias, he said, surprised but smooth. Wasn't sure you'd come. I looked at him once, then sat porn. When the chairman asked if I had a statement, I opened the folder, 1 hour Hananon, there's room, removed 3 sheets, and handed them across. The first, documentation of vendor fraud. The second, evidence of non-disclosed conflicts of interest. The third, the amendment my father filed 1 week before he died, restoring full succession rights to his named heir. Signed, notarized, unchallenged. Silence fell like snowfall. Not harsh. I see. Malcolm's hands curled on the table. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The vote took 6 minutes. Unanimous. His tenure ended at noon. By 1, his key card was deactivated. By 2, his name was gone from the directory. I left the building without fanfare, without press, without fury, because winning loudly is for those who need to be seen. But building something that cannot be touched, that's legacy, and mine had just begun. ChatGPT Janoi, I didn't return to my office the next day. I didn't stand at a podium. I didn't issue a statement or walk the production floor to shaking hands and hushed applause. That would have been Malcolm's play a spectacle to disguise an empty victory. Instead, I went home, poured a glass of water, sat in the chair my father used to favor in the corner of the den, by the window where the light caught the dust like snow, and I breathed. The quiet was different now. Not the void of loss, but the fullness that follows precision. The kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts again. My father used to say, the best structures are invisible. You only notice them when they fail. That stayed with me, especially now, because while Malcolm had tried to paint over the foundation, I had reinforced it silently. From beneath, the following week, I started the real work. Not just restoring titles or undoing what had been done, but reimagining what legacy could look like in a world addicted to speed. I didn't want to return to how things were. My father was a visionary, but he was also a man of his time. We were no longer in his time. We were in mine. I hired 3 young engineers from a university innovation grant program, gave them a budget, a small team, and 1 mandate. Find the inefficiencies we've stopped noticing. Within 6 weeks, they found 7 Some were small, forgotten redundancies. Others, Foundational misalignments between production and distribution that had cost us hundreds of thousands over years. No one else had ever pointed them out, not because they weren't visible, but because no one was looking anymore. We'd been too focused on scale, not enough on soul. I initiated a restructuring of leadership not in rank, but in rhythm, fewer silos, more cross-functional design, more listening. I met with every department head personally, not to tell them what to do, but to ask what they would do if the fear of failure was removed. Some had nothing to say. They were too conditioned to survive. Not imagine. Others quietly, hesitantly began to speak. I kept a notebook. I didn't talk much, just recorded ideas, tensions, dreams. We were surrender. It wasn't about a revolution. It was about returning to the blueprint my father had carried in his bones, but re-rendering it in new light. There were setbacks. Of course there were. Some contracts couldn't be undone. Some clients had been burned too deeply by Malcolm's arrogance to trust us again. Some team members resigned, preferring chaos to calm. I didn't chase them. Some walls aren't meant to be held up. They're meant to fall and make room for something better. 2 months after Malcolm's removal, I walked the main factory floor. It smelled like oil and metal and sweat, a smell I'd grown up with. I shook hands, asked names, made eye contact, not because I wanted loyalty, but because I wanted them to remember this place still had a pulse. At one workstation, a woman in her 50s paused mid-well to ask, "You the new boss?" I smiled faintly. "I'm the old son." She nodded. "He was proud of you, your daddy." I nodded once, then walked on. That was enough. Some nights, I still dreamed of the funeral, but not the part you'd expect. Not the grave form. Went in everybody paminum. Not the flowers. I dreamed of Malcolm's hand on my shoulder. The weight of it. The way it lingered, like he'd already claimed something that didn't belong to him. In the dream, I didn't shrug him off. I didn't speak. I just stood there, letting the betrayal settle where it needed to. Because the deepest betrayals are the ones you don't fight. They're the ones you outgrow. 3 months later, a letter arrived from the State Ethics Commission. An anonymous tip had triggered a formal inquiry into vendor fraud during Malcolm's interim tenure. I hadn't filed anything. I hadn't needed to. The documents had a life of their own. The inquiry led to headlines. Quiet ones, at first, then louder. Kia Surasurinen. His consulting firm collapsed within 6 weeks. A board he'd joined in Charleston issued a formal suspension. I never called him, never wrote, but I knew he saw my name in those articles. And I knew what he felt. Not fear, not even guilt, but recognition. The understanding that I hadn't fought him in the way he expected I had, dismantled him with the tools he underestimated most. Discipline, clarity. A memory can and I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne. No calls to old friends. Just an evening at the river's edge. The same bench my father used to sit on during lunch breaks. Back when the company was still small enough to fit inside one warehouse. I watched the cargo ships pass. Watched the light fall across the water like spilled gold. There's a kind of peace that comes when you no longer need anyone to know what you survived. That's when you know the wound is closed, not vanished. Not forgotten. Just sealed. One morning, my assistant slid an envelope across my desk. No return address. Inside, a photo. It was old, maybe 20 years. My father and I, both in coveralls, standing in front of the original factory entrance. We looked tired, greasy, alive. Tucked into the frame was a note. For the blueprint that never crumbled. No name, no signature. I didn't need one. I stood that afternoon in the hall where we displayed milestones, blueprints, patents, letters of recognition. I added the photo, just to the left of the founder's plaque. No plaque under it, no title, just the image. Let whoever sees it wonder what it means. Because legacy doesn't need a spotlight, it just needs to endure. Winter came late that year. The air carried a softness I hadn't felt in a long time, not warm, not forgiving, just less sharp. I walked to work most days now, through the quieter streets of Savannah where the oak branches curled like old fingers over the sidewalks. Nobody recognized me, and I preferred it that way. My name was still on the building, but my presence no longer needed to be announced. It had become part of the walls again, like it was when I started, fresh out of college, wearing borrowed shoes and trying not to drown under my father's expectations. The press tried to tell the story, Disgraced CEO, replaced by founder's son in silent power shift. They missed the real part. The silence wasn't just circumstance. It was design. When the dust settles and the noise dies, only the architecture remains. And what I rebuilt wasn't just the company. It was the ethos, the spine, the reason this place mattered. Malcolm disappeared from the headlines within a few weeks. Moved west. I heard. Tried starting another venture. Investors didn't follow. He underestimated something I never spoke of. Not even to my father. Inheritance is not just what is given. It's what you choose to carry. And I carried it in a way Malcolm never could, not in my voice, not in my name, but in my discipline, my refusal to be reactive, my insistence on knowing every inch of the ground before I took a single step forward. One evening, I visited my father's grave. The sun had dipped below the trees, and the headstones glowed with the last light of the day. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't kneel. I just stood, hands in pockets, coat wrapped tight. You were right, I said quietly. It wasn't about ownership. It was about stewardship. The wind rustled the leaves in reply. I stayed until the light vanished completely. Weeks later, our board voted unanimously to initiate the Maddox Foundation, a long-term philanthropic wing focused on education and ethics in industrial design. I didn't name it after myself. I named it after the first blueprint my father ever drew by hand. Back in 1972, Framework 1. I found it in a box in the attic, yellowed, edges curled, but every line still clear. That's how you know something was built to last. Not that it survives the elements, but that it keeps its shape even when no one's looking. We launched our first program through a trade school on the outskirts of Macon scholarships for low-income apprentices with a focus on systems design. One recipient, a 19-year-old woman named Elias, sent a handwritten note after her acceptance. I want to build things that don't break people. Thank you for seeing someone like me. I kept that note in my wallet. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I'd read it again, just to remind myself that victory isn't loud. It doesn't come with fireworks or applause. It comes with a stillness you've earned, a life you've returned to, with nothing left to prove. The house felt too large now, too full of echoes that didn't belong to the present. So I sold it, packed what mattered, a few books, the blueprint, my father's old watch, and moved into a loft above the warehouse district. Brick walls, iron windows. No luxury, just function and light. It was there, in that sparse, silent space, that I began writing again. Not speeches, not reports, just thoughts. Observations. Strategies I wish someone had told me at 23. I didn't know what I'd do with them. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But the act of writing, of returning thought to form, felt like laying a new foundation beneath my own feet. One night, while finishing a page on legacy versus ego, my phone buzzed. A message from my sister. We hadn't spoken much since the funeral. I read about what happened. Dad would have been proud. Maybe now we can talk. I'd like that. I stared at the screen for a long time, then typed only. Me too. Sometimes, reconciliation starts in the smallest possible way. Not a confession, not a demand, but a willingness to open a door. The next morning, I woke early and walked to the riverfront. The air was crisp. A thin fog sat over the water. I stood near the railing and watched a ship pass under the bridge. Quiet, deliberate, carrying its weight without rush. A thought rose, uninvited but welcome. She took the money. He took the company. They took the silence. And I took it all back without raising my voice. Because the greatest power isn't what you own, it's what you protect. And the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's building something they can't touch. Not because you kept them out, but because you moved so far beyond them. They no longer matter.